Order. Well, welcome everyone to the latest meeting of the Environmental Audit Committee, and this is a one-off session that we are doing on Peatland as a result of the Environment in Focus investigation that we did. We had representations on both peatlands and woodlands, and the committee decided that we would like to do a look at these matters. I'm pleased to say that we have an excellent panel in front of us, and I will invite them to introduce themselves in a moment. If I could ask you to firstly tell us who you are, the organisation that you represent, and who they are, and then secondly, give us a basic assessment as to what the current state of our peatlands are, and your organisation's perspective on the matter. So if I could start with yourself, Ms. Nex, and then I will go to your two colleagues.
Thank you very much. So I'm Sally Nex. I am the advocate for the Peat-free partnership. We are a very broad coalition that draws together horticultural businesses and industry with organisations like the RHS and Garden Organic and the National Trust, also ENGOs like Plant Life, who hosts us, and the RSPB, Wildlife Trusts, all sorts of, as I say, it's a very wide spectrum. We are focused on securing legislation to end peat sales for horticulture across all 4 nations of the UK, basically, you know, that's essentially what we're about. It's legislation that has been on the cards for a very long time, but it's been an unfulfilled promise ever since. Well, it depends when you want to start it, really. The first sort of targets were set in about 2010, so we're now 16 years on, and still no sign of any legislation anywhere in the UK. So as regards the state of peatlands, it's a bit of a sad tale, really, because our peatlands have the potential to be one of our most important defences against the threat of climate change. They are exceptionally good carbon stores, so the carbon sequestration that they offer is extreme. So, for example, they occupy 12% of the UK's land area, but they absorb as much carbon as all of our forests and woodlands put together. That's because if you look at a peatland from above, it occupies quite a small area on the top, so you might think that it doesn't have the capability to absorb that much carbon, but in fact, due to the way they form, the depths can be extraordinary. They can be between 3 metres and 9 metres deep in places, and all of that is concentrated carbon because of the way that peat bogs form, because they form anaerobically. So this means that it also forms very slowly, so at the rate of about 1 millimetre a year, or 1 metre per 1,000 years. So when you're looking at 3 to 9 metres of depth of peat bog, you're looking at 3,000 to 9,000 years of carbon deposits. So that's why they are such exceptionally good stores when they are in good condition. But unfortunately, about 80% of our peatlands, according to the England Peat Map, which was published last year, 80% of our peatlands are in damaged, graded, drained condition, and that means that they are now turning from what could be our most efficient carbon sinks into net carbon emitters. And that's because when a peat bog is drained or extracted for peat sales to horticulture, the carbon that it contains is exposed to the air, and that is carbon dioxide, which, as we know, is a greenhouse gas. So that is how they contribute to climate change. Now, in terms of other services that that a healthy peatland can give us, really important ecosystem services, things like flood prevention, water purification. About 70% of the UK's water, drinking water, comes through highlands, most of which are peatlands. And wildfire limitation as well. There was a celebrated case in Wales at, excuse my pronunciation, but Llyn-Gorast in mid-Wales, where re-wetted, restored peatland stopped a wildfire in its tracks. The peatland that was next door, which was drained and due to be restored, was blackened and completely destroyed. So this is the services that Peatlands can provide us are exceptionally good, and they need to be preserved and valued for what they can offer us.
Okay, well, thank you very much. A very comprehensive introduction to the issues and the importance of peatlands. If I can turn to you, Mr. Denny, firstly, if there's anything you want to respond to in that, or anything you want to say from the perspective of your organisation about the value of peatlands, and also just sort of top-level overview of your perspective on the health of our peatlands and what's being done.
Thank you. If I start by introducing the Horticultural Association very briefly, we represent the businesses in the UK which are involved with the supply of plants and trees to our gardens, green spaces, forestry, etc. That's unusual for a trade association that we go right through the supply chain through from the manufacturers, which include most of the UK's growing media manufacturers, as well as some of the producers of the substrates that go into those, as well as the growers who are producing those plants and trees as commercial crops, through to the 30 million gardeners who are going to the garden centre and buying their plants. So our interest in this is really about how that industry transitions away from peat and making sure that some of the regulatory barriers are unpicked and that some of the practical support has gone through. I wouldn't really kind of build on anything Sally said about the value of peatlands. You know, the ecosystem benefits are very clear cut. Our focus within the peatlands themselves is twofold. One is on the extractive areas of peat for horticulture, which is around 2,000 hectares and diminishing. So we're looking at how we kind of reduce that, transition it. But also around land use as well, which has the potential to be used to scale up some of those peat alternatives, such as sphagnum moss. So our focus really is about how do we kind of balance the three pillars of sustainability. It's the economic, it's the environmental and the social. To have a little bit of flavour about our members, we often talk about how big our industry is and its economic footprint, but to bring that to life, the typical grower in our membership is about £3 to £5 million turnover. These are family businesses, SMEs, that, forgive the pun, are deeply rooted in their local communities. And so really what our plan, sorry, I couldn't help it. But what we're really trying to do there is the practical support to help those guys move away from it, because there's some very real consequences for getting a commercial crop wrong or even a little bit wrong, which affects their ability to inward invest in things like water resilient and some of the investments and experience and skills curves that those businesses need to go through to transition away from peat. So
yeah, well, thank you very much for that, and we'll explore some of those questions as we move forward. But just to be absolutely clear, in terms of the importance of peatlands and the health of them currently, you wouldn't disagree with anything we heard from Ms. Nex?
Not at all. It's the 0.07% of peatlands that are used for commercial horticulture extraction that we're focused on. But yes, we absolutely endorse and accept the value of peatlands. Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you. Now to you, Mr. Gilruth, if you could just again explain the perspective that your membership has on this. If there's anything you want to add in terms of the value and current state of our peatlands, please do, and then your perspective on their health and what's been done so far.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, committee. I'm Andrew Gilruth, the Chief Executive of the Moorland Association. Our members manage 1 million acres. Much of it is the deep peat we've just been hearing about. Last year, wildfires destroyed vast quantities of that peat, and as DEFRA's bans on the controlled burning of vegetation causes a huge build-up of fuel loads, these fires increasingly threaten the lives of your constituents. I'll be giving evidence on how DEFRA is totally isolated from the international consensus, how it is defying warnings from our national fire chiefs, and how officials have badly misled ministers over the science. Thank you.
Well, I mean, you've come out swinging there. Just to expand slightly, and obviously we'll get into details, but I mean, to suggest that government officials have deliberately misled ministers, and it's led to damaging the very habitats that they claim they wish to repair is not a minor charge. So do you want to just expand upon that slightly?
Well, thank you, Chair. You're absolutely right that this is a serious issue, and I'd also take it back a stage further. We're talking about where peatlands have been drained. We should remember those are that has been government policy to actually drain those moors and dry them out. Moving on to ministers being badly misled over the science. Last month, DEFRA told Parliament that the evidence review on which the burning de facto ban was based was subject to rigorous peer review. Yet this document, which I can email to members afterwards, this one actually says that the officials, however hard they try to wriggle, it shows that there was no rigorous peer review, and the DEFRA policy, which threatens the lives of your constituents, is actually built on a house of cards.
Can we be
Just
specific?
I'd like to give you some
examples. A
examples.
lot of accusations together. I'm interested in some actual facts here.
Okay, can I give you some? So one of the reviewers in this peer review process said that they could not pretend to have read it from end to end, while another that their brain could not keep track. Reviewers were given no written brief, terms of reference or guidance. They had no templates, questions or scoring systems. Those that did not respond...
What is wrong with the actual report from your perspective?
It is a work of fantasy that we've ended up with a government policy which is in defiance of the international consensus. Last year, the G7, the EU, all agreed that actually controlled burning was an important element of reducing wildfire risk. The only people which decided that we should introduce a de facto ban was DEFRA.
Right, okay. So to be specific, because, as I say, I think what's helpful here is to keep focused on the factual matters of the issue rather than who sort of said or did what. You don't disagree, or do you disagree with what Ms Neck said about the state of our peatlands? And if so, are you saying that actually controlled burning would have improved that? Is that what you're trying to say?
Controlled burning is very much in a situation whereby through this de facto ban, you're putting the very peat which we're seeking to protect at risk.
So you do believe that what Ms Neck said about the state of our peatlands is true, but you have a different idea as to what should be done about it?
I'm not sure we've got any difference of opinion. We all want to achieve the same thing.
Right. Okay. And then Ms Neck, just bring you in briefly before I move on. I mean, from your perspective there, if we kind of stick to the main thrust of the remarks that we've just heard from Mr Gilruth, what was your response to the suggestion that actually more controlled burning rather than the approach DEFRA is taking would be better?
Well, the way I see it is that there are two things that need to go hand in hand here, because the reason why burning and degraded peat sort of go hand in hand is because degraded peat is dry. It's dry habitat. It's not the way that peatlands are meant to be. So, for example, I think 3/4 of peatlands are covered by plants and land uses associated with dry conditions. So we're talking about arable horticulture, bare and abandoned former peat workings, all of those kinds of things. And that's why they are not behaving in the way that a peat bog should do. It needs to go hand in hand with accelerated peatland restoration, which is re-wetting of peatland. And as soon as you get peatland that's re-wetted and able to function as the ecosystem it was meant to be, then burning does not become an issue. It reverts to its natural habitat. And so therefore, it's just the two need to go hand in hand in order to prevent, to see through, if you like, the intended impact of banning burning. You do need to restore peatlands properly as well.
And Mr Gilruth, why do your members not want to wet peatland but instead want to have controlled burning?
Our members are thoroughly delighted to re-wet their peat, and I wish the committee to be totally clear on that. The issue is we need to deal with reality. You start re-wetting the peat, in many situations you actually increase rather than decrease the vegetation growth, and it increases the fuel loads. It is perfectly possible that you follow the line of argument which Sally's just outlined. However, that is the view that's taken by Natural England, that at some point in the future we should be able to reach a utopian state where land will naturally be fire resilient. Try and tell that to the Canadians who lost peatland, had burnt an area 2 years ago that was larger than the size of the whole of England and most of Wales. It's fair enough to be able to say that re-wetting is incredibly helpful, and all of our members are desperately trying to do that. But let's be honest, once we've filled in all the ditches, which the government told us to start digging, and those have all been filled in, you can't keep water on top of a hill. Nor can you keep water in a location where there is very little water. So, for example, the North York Moors, which had a terrible wildfire last summer, you would struggle to re-wet it because there is very little rainfall. There are no rivers and there are no drains, and it was not extensively drained. So we have to take a slightly more proactive approach, and we do have a national asset up on that moor at RAF Filingdales. And we lost 5,500 acres of moorland last year, and it cannot keep happening. The last time that the North York Moors caught fire was the same area, unmanaged, same problem.
Thank you. Ross Savage.
Thank you, Chair. This is a question for Sally next, please. So in your introductory remarks, you outlined the many benefits of healthy peatlands. Thank you for that. So given those valuable functions that they can serve in terms of climate change mitigation, nature recovery and net zero targets, do you think that they are suitably highly prioritised in government policy?
I think that there is a priority given to them in government policy, but I think that government policy is not joined up, it's not consistent, it contradicts itself. It is very difficult to see the way through. It seems to me that a lot of the time peat policy is siloed. So you're either talking about a peat ban for horticulture, or you're talking about peatland restoration, or you're talking about peatland burning. But you're never seeing it as a whole. Peatlands are a whole, and they should be seen in the round. And there is not very much evidence of that approach within government policy. It's different bits of DEFRA that seem to deal with different bits of peatland policy, when actually a much more joined-up approach is required. There's also a feeling that there's a failure to grasp the nettle when it comes to actually legislating for example, ending peat sales in horticulture. It isn't a straightforward thing to do, but it's something which has been very well talked through and very well developed. The issues are extremely well understood, and as I said earlier, we have had years to do that. If there almost isn't any more talking to be done. We've shown that there is a lot of support within the horticulture industry for legislation, just for the sheer clarity that it would bring and the end to business uncertainty, which it's been the industry has been labouring under for years and years now. So there's support within the industry. There's cross-party support amongst MPs. There is. We've just handed in a petition, which was it's now over 17,000 signatures, calling for legislation this year in the next parliamentary session. There is public support as well. 2/3 of gardeners are actively choosing peat-free compost. This is something that is desired and wanted. It's such a popular policy, it is inexplicable why it hasn't gone through. The only thing that can explain that is that it's just a bit too difficult. And that's not really...
When you say difficult, do you mean expensive?
Not necessarily, because, as I say, this is causing real harm to the horticultural industry at the moment. They are literally being left in limbo, with absolutely no direction, no timetable. They're under a vague threat of legislation at some point, who knows when. They have no way of knowing whether to invest, what to invest in, what deadlines to work to, absolutely nothing. This is harmful to the industry. It's preventing them from the industry from moving forward and developing as much as it would be able to do, and growing as much as it would be able to do. had it got the certainty of knowing where they are on peat policy. It's a really big issue within the industry. As soon as you start talking to anybody for any length of time in the horticulture industry, they'll start to talk to you about peat.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Julia Buckley.
Thank you. So just continuing on that proposed ban when parliamentary time allows, to what extent would you say England has kept pace with the devolved nations in this?
Well, in some ways, the devolved nations are actually a little bit ahead of England, to be honest. An end to peat sales has been stated policy in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland for many years now. Not so much in Northern Ireland, of course, because they had the break in legislation, but in Scotland, it was in the programme for government 21 to 22. Wales has had a stated policy since 22. Northern Ireland published its peatland policy last year, and in there, they are ahead of everybody, actually, because they stated a policy to phase out peat use in horticulture by 2030, so they're the only ones who've put a date on it. England, on the other hand, or the UK government, has simply said when parliamentary time allows, as you say, which is so vague as to be meaningless, actually. The thing is that in the recent, there was a recent meeting of the EFRA-IMG, the Interministerial Group, which is information exchange for environmental ministers from all over the UK. Just before that meeting happened, the Scottish Agriculture Minister, Jim Fairley, wrote a fairly strongly worded letter to the Secretary of State, basically saying, let's get on with this. The general frustration that is felt amongst the devolved nations on this matter came to a head at that meeting. And it was decided, first of all, that this would go forward as a joint piece of legislation because the devolved nations have been prevented effectively from acting on what should be a devolved issue by the Internal Market Act 2020. So they have decided to go forward as a joint piece of legislation, and in addition to that, DEFRA also undertook a commitment to produce options for a time frame towards legislation at that meeting. We very much hope that DEFRA will stick to that promise and bring forward those options at the earliest opportunity, ideally by the next EFRA-IMG, which is, we're told, happening towards the end of this month.
So just imagine that you had a mechanism to get a message through to the people who are drafting the King's Speech for next year's list of legislation. And imagine that mechanism is the report of today's session. And so any recommendations in there will be read by the ministers who will feed in to the people drafting next year's list of legislation. What information could you bring today to explain the cost or the challenge or the consequences of losing another year, of not doing this this year?
The trouble is, peat is a non-renewable resource. It forms so slowly that under any human lifestyle, it is completely non-renewable. Every year that passes, we're digging out another 900,000, now it's 760,000 cubic metres of peat, not necessarily just from England, 60%, or indeed most of it comes from Scotland and Northern Ireland in terms of the UK supply. There is also 60% of the peat that UK horticulture uses is imported as well. Every single year, that peat is coming out of a peat bog somewhere, contributing to climate change. Climate change, we know, is no respecter of boundaries. It's going to affect the climate change crisis, whether it comes from Finland or Scotland or Somerset levels. But the fact is that every single year those peat bogs are being depleted. They're not going to come back. They're not going to be recreated. That peat is gone. And so that's the urgency, the reason why we need this to happen. If you want the economic argument, it's simply to end this business uncertainty because it is such a block for the horticulture industry at the moment. And I feel really sorry for the people who are having to labour under this level of insecurity and uncertainty and just not knowing what to do for the best. It's impossible.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I mean, just give Mr Denny an opportunity to respond to that. You had Musnek's sympathy for your members there. Are they, I mean, just reflect on what you've heard about the sense which your members A, are desperate for certainty, and B, is the certainty that they're desperate for what's being proposed?
Yeah, I mean, I would pick up on 2 points Sally made there. The first, that it's not simple. She's right, either from a regulatory or a kind of technical point of view, but also from the certainty. Certainty is what our industry needs on all sorts of levels, so it would echo that. The members that we have are caught on the horns of a dilemma around this. Building on the kind of joined up policy point that Sally made, our instinct is that DEFRA's policy on this has been a little like tunnel vision and a real lack of system thinking about what regulation and what collaboration could be done to enable that transition. So we've heard lots of talk about a ban, as if that's the only regulatory barrier or enabler for this to happen. There's a lot of stuff that we've been asking and suggesting to DEFRA that they could do to unlock some of those things.
Okay, well, we'll come on to some of that in more detail, I think, in a moment, but I just wanted to sort of give you an opportunity, seeing as the horticultural industry's desires was being spoken for you, to make sure that it was consistent with your members' views. Martin.
Thank you. Just to follow on from that, Mr. Denny, in terms of the horticultural industry, how reliant is it on peat, and how prepared is it for a potential ban on the use of peat or products with peat in them?
It's reliant most in the professional sector, which is businesses that are producing plants and trees as a commercial crop. So at the moment, the levels of that are falling. They're falling substantially, but about, on average, a third of the growing media that they use is composed of peat. What they're dependent on is a managed and manageable transition across from that. So if they get it even slightly wrong with the replacements, or how those replacements interact with each other in the crop, and they're facing into losses, really serious losses. That is a cost and a risk. The other cost and risk is the raw material that goes into it. So when we asked our grower members in a survey in 2024, what would it take in terms of the cost of that substrate to go entirely peat-free tomorrow? And it was a 37% increase. I want to put that into something that's a little bit less abstract. Most of our grower members will be working on operating profit of 5 to 10% profit. That increase would take up between about 15 and 35% of their operating profit were it to happen. So when you factor in all the other costs that they're trying to deal with, increases in living wage, increase in water, increasing extended producer responsibilities, there's very little margin for error. And really, a lot of the things that DEFRA could do further back in the supply chain to ease some of their costs, to ease some of the regulation, just aren't really happening. So it's dependent on peat. Can crops be produced without peat? Yes, they absolutely can. About a quarter of our members are already peat-free. What they're dependent on is a manageable, reasonable time frame with regulatory interventions that enable that to be a success, and for us to not have really kind of perverse disincentive that the businesses fail and we end up bringing in plants and trees from overseas with more carbon miles, which ironically are produced in, at the moment, 60 to 70% peat.
And in terms of moving to alternatives to peat, what does the research tell us in terms of what are the alternatives that could be used?
There's near-term and long-term ones. So the near-term ones are materials like wood fibres and barks and coir. Those are kind of main ones. You could add into that digestate fibres. Now, what they all have in common is they're byproducts from other industries. So, wood chippings from the forestry industry, digestate fibre from the production of biogas, and coir as a byproduct of coconuts. So they're dependent on other economies and other those areas. So those are the main ones in the near term. They're volatile in terms of their supply chains, and there are regulations there that could be made easier to access them. So if I take wood fibres, which are the bulk one, they're dependent on the forestry industry. Something that could really help there is with DEFRA meeting its tree planting targets in the long term as the byproducts from the forestry industry. Waste wood would be another one. At the moment, if I wanted to reprocess Class A, which is uncontaminated waste wood, pallets the like, there's a huge amount of regulation that you have to go through to reprocess in terms of easements on waste regulations. If I wanted to import wood chip, there are very good reasons for having phytosanitary controls on not just being able to bring those in. but it is a hugely complex kind of raft to navigate. And I was talking to one of our growing media manufacturers last week who's already peat-free, and they threw their hands up. They said, we just could not go near importing it. It's so complex. So those are the near-term ones. Slightly longer term, sphagnum moss would be an example. So that is essentially farmed sphagnum. There's some really good trials that DEFRA and some of our members have been involved with, looking at the yields for that. They show a lot of promise, but again, on the regulatory side of that, a barrier to scaling that up would be the capital investment that farmers might need to wet and irrigate that, but also to convert grasslands to kind of production. Now, there's very good reasons for disincentivizing, converting grasslands to other purposes. But again, a pragmatic, can-do, innovative approach to working with us on those transitions, rather than just wielding a ban without really thinking about how that could work in pragmatic terms, is how we're most dependent on government.
Yeah, and to me, I think the next question that rises in my mind is in terms of, at the moment, you've got people who have switched to being peat-free, and they're using these alternatives, and you're talking about potential other ones. What is the supply of that in terms of if we were to move to either voluntarily or through legislation, everybody switching to peat-free, in terms of, is there enough supply of these alternatives at the moment? How quickly could we get to that level of supply? Where would they be coming from? Would they be coming from within the UK, or are we importing them? What would be the need?
Yeah, depends on the supply stream. So something like Koya, for example, clearly that's all imported. It's vulnerable to supply chains disruption, as we've seen over the recent week. And globally, there is enough of it. But what we're going to see is increasing competition for that, as more food crops, more urban greening solutions around the world have to compete for these materials. So there's a great study from Wageningen, I'll try and give my Dutch pronunciation or lack of it, Wageningen University, which is forecasting, I think, 700% global increase in demand for Koya by the year 2050. For wood fibre, their figures are, I think, 1,250% increase in demand for this. Even if those factors are exaggerated by a long way, that is still a huge amount of global competition. So to answer the question directly, there's enough material. What will be an issue is processing it, making sure that can be done in an environmentally and economically sustainable way, and competing for it in the longer term.
But we would be more reliant in terms of on a global market than we are currently.
Very much more so, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Barry Gardner.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Gilruth, can I just check something with you about what you were saying? Because you're absolutely right. Successive governments did absolutely incentivize land managers to drain the upland moors. Many of us thought it was a disastrous policy at the time, but that was what the governments did, and I totally understand where you're coming from there. And they did that because they wanted to encourage the production of young, nutrient-rich fodder, partly for the grazing and partly for the way in which it would aid shooting in grouse moors and so on. There was a dramatic reduction in key peatland species, though, as a result of that. Sphagnum declined, there was trampling by the livestock and the grazing, and that resulted in a change to the vegetation and turning it into heath and acid grassland, much of it. Now, I looked, when you talked about the North York moors, I did a quick Google search and looked up the precipitation on the moors, because you said that it's very difficult to keep water on a hill. But of course, the Lord does tend to provide, and he provides very well on the North York moors, because I gather that the average rainfall over a 31-day period is between 40 and 100 millilitres. So there is a constant supply, and if the chocks were in place that were taken out to allow the drainage, would you agree that if those peatlands were in pristine condition, in that wet condition that you say your members actually would love to restore them to, then actually what Ms. Next said is correct, that a healthy peatland that is wetted would actually reduce the need to have controlled burns, which are there at the moment to stop fires spreading. And indeed, I think she adumbrated an example of that in Wales last year, where a fire had stopped at a healthy peat. So are we agreed in the objective that we all wish to get to?
I think I might nuance a little bit, and it's very easy to have generalisations. So, for example...
I try to be as specific as possible.
No, but of course. But let's deal with some reality. So, the North York Moors, how are you going to stop it going through the bedrock underneath? So, and there's huge parts of the Peak District we've got the same issue. And no one has come up with any mapping which will actually tell us how much of it can genuinely be re-wetted. And so to assume that you can achieve it everywhere is a classic mistake. There are very, very few drains on the North York Moors were ever dug, and they were dug for agricultural purposes. You're absolutely right. No government ever paid for a ditch to be dug on a grouse moor for the benefit of sporting purposes. And they've got no benefit for sporting purposes, otherwise they might have been dug by the Victorians.
They didn't pay for it, but it was done. Look, I don't want to pursue this too much, because
may I come back on one other point you raised about areas that have been re-wetted. Places that are ideal for being re-wetted. So, for example, the flow country, which actually is completely different. I mean, it's actually a soup bowl as opposed to being on a hog's back on top of a hill. In 2019, there was a significant wildfire there, and they estimated that 700,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent were released in that fire. So please don't tell me that re-wetting solves all of our problems. It is also the case that in 2025, so last year, the emissions as a result of wildfire equate to 12% of all of the peatland emissions in England. So please pay attention to how much we're losing to wildfire. Just because it doesn't appear in a table doesn't mean that it's not important.
Mr. Gilruth,
Thank you.
I entirely accept that the wildfires and the burning are causing emissions. My point to you would simply be this, that if we have, as you said, a shared objective in that your members want to see the re-wetting, then let's focus on that. You said that, in fact, there was... you said that there was not a... Sorry, I lost my train of thought there for momentarily. But
I'll come back on another point, and then you might...
Let me just try and grasp hold of it if I can as it flees away.
On the re-wetting, so for example, there's an excellent piece of work being done in the Peak District at Eastern Moors. It's actually a moor that's owned by Sheffield City Council. It's currently managed by the RSPB and the National Trust. It's an amazing flagship site to go and see. The aspiration through re-wetting is to make it wildfire resilient, but I'd like to point out to this committee that is an aspiration which no one has been able to manage to demonstrate any landscape that is fire resilient as a result of re-wetting, but they believe that they can achieve it within 50 years. When asked with any of the officials, which you'll be speaking to next, ask them if they can take you to anywhere in the world where a landscape has been made wildfire resilient as a result of re-wetting, because whenever we've asked them, they say there isn't anywhere. So we have to be careful about making generalisations. It is very important to re-wet the peat. We need more peat, and we need to protect what we've got.
But Mr. Gilruth, you did make some generalisations, because you said, what you've just done as well in saying that nowhere in the world, but you said that there was no reason to do the re-wetting because no mapping had been done. But surely that's no reason to decide that you should just have burning of the peat in order to stop...
Trying to make it clear to the committee that if you want to have a generalisation and to choose a single tool, which is what DEFRA have done, in order to restore and make your land wildfire resilient, watch out, because if you can't re-wet it, what are you now proposing to do? And it's very risky for any government, and I think we will soon be back in the same place again. And in the short term, in the intervening...
That's the kind of despair, isn't it? Because you see, if you can't re-wet it, then you've got to watch out because you'll get those wildfires. But I like to stick with the positive. And you said that your members want to re-wet the land.
Absolutely.
In that case, let's make sure that the mapping is being done that enables us to do that most effectively in the most appropriate places. Yes?
Thank you. I think if we were clear about that, because also we should not ignore...
I must move on because
Okay.
the chair didn't actually allow me to ask you a question.
Okay, I'll bring Chris Hinchliffe in now.
Thank you, Chair. And Mr. Gilruth, I'm going to continue along a sort of similar line of conversation. I think you've made it fairly clear from your initial comments that you don't agree with the government when they say they believe they've reached a consensus that burning vegetation on blanket bogs is damaging to peatland formation. And
They've formed their own consensus, but it's in defiance of the consensus from around the world.
Right, okay, brilliant. So that was the point I wanted to come to. And thank you for your note to the committee earlier, raising some of your concerns about that. So you highlighted statements by the EU, G7, US and Scottish Government.
Yep.
I've looked at those. The EU, G7 and US talk about controlled burning generically,
Yes.
but do not mention peatland specifically. And the Scottish Government is still planning to implement its ban in autumn this year. So, again, sort of come back to my colleague's point, does that not leave some space for a consensus around absolutely accepting that vegetation burning is an important tool in certain contexts, but for deep peat, that re-wetting is the preferred approach?
The laws of physics, Chair, in relation to fire, is not interested in what's underneath. What we have to do is we've got to protect the peat underneath, and we're trying to avoid a hot fire getting down into the peat and destroying it. In order to avoid that, any firefighter sitting here from anywhere around the world will tell you not to have a large fuel load sitting above it, so the surface fuels allow the peat to ignite. The reason it took months, so the North York Moors fire broke out on the 28th of June. It was not officially extinguished until the 22nd of December. We couldn't get it out because it got into the peat. The smouldering fires are the dangerous ones. They retain their heat, they destroy the peat and everything that we need. So we've got to be focused on reality. We've also got to be focused on the real threat. The fire chiefs made clear in their submission to DEFRA last summer that they felt that the ban could increase the danger to firefighters and the public. And I feel that that was a warning, was a flashing red light. And I think that it's embarrassing to DEFRA that when it met the fire chiefs, the officials decided not to take any minutes. It has transpired this morning in response to a parliamentary question that was seen now as an administrative error. And I suggest that DEFRA is now in retreat. Earlier, it was saying that this was a rigorous, is basing the reason that we're travelling in the opposite direction to the rest of the world is because of this Natural England's evidence review, which has been done rigorously. Now, DEFRA has backtracked on that. This morning, it's now saying anything questions to do with the evidence review need to be referred to Natural England. It's no longer calling it a rigorous peer review. And equally, Natural England, when they were queried, I asked Marion Spain about this on the 28th of February. Her office came back to me on Monday saying that there'd be no further communication about this because it was subject to a legal challenge. I went back and asked what legal challenge, and I didn't understand why I'd received a communication from the Natural England Correspondence Unit from a do not reply email address saying they will not follow any further communication on this. By the afternoon, I'd received an email, I queried it. By the afternoon, I'd received an email from the Natural England Chief of Staff saying that actually that was an administrative error, and in actual fact, we would receive a clear response to our letter. These administrative responses keep happening, and I suggest it is no wonder that those that live and work in the rural community are losing faith in the government approach to this.
Thank you, Mr. Good. Your frustration is clear. I perhaps naively one further time. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature UK Peatland programme say they've undertaken a detailed review of the evidence which concludes that wet peatlands are less prone to wildfires and that healthy peatlands do not need burning for their maintenance. They say the most effective long-term sustainable solution for addressing wildfire risk on peatlands is to return the sites to fully functioning bog habitat, and crucially, I think, given what you said, they say that their position is that re-wetting and restoring will naturally remove the higher fuel load from degraded peatland vegetation. So I just want a final point of clarity then. Do you disagree with the science of that, or is there anything that you can say to the committee today that we can take forward as a recommendation for the government to help your members move towards the aspiration, which I appreciate you've outlined there's a large gap in reality between where we are and that aspiration?
The gap is about the arrangement of fuels on the surface. It is not about just reducing all fuels. It is about how they're actually reduced. And if you speak to any firefighters, wildfire fighters from around the world, and you ask them about the IUCN report, which is actually a DEFRA-led sort of quango run by the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, that is aspirational dream. That is the example I talked about in the Peak District, which is the 50-year dream about trying to create a fire-resilient landscape. No one anywhere in the world has managed to achieve it, including in Canada. And there is a real risk here. So if you go to the Natural England's lead upland site, which is at Moorhouse National Nature Reserve, the fuel loads on that moor are near continuous and they're about 8 tonnes per hectare. That is near the upper limit of wildfire capability anywhere in the world. You are reaching a point where it doesn't matter how many aircraft or helicopters or any other pieces of kit, you will not be able to tackle the fire, because once the temperature gets too hot, you get pyroconvection and that creates its own weather. That is when firefighters get killed. And I'm bringing that to attention to this committee now, because every nation that has gone down this route of trying to curb and limit the controlled burning in the winter has ultimately, it doesn't matter whether it's North America, South America, or in Europe, has changed its position. And each time it's changed its position when people have been killed. And surely, we should not be waiting in this country for a coroner to provide direction on this point. Surely it is Parliament and this committee which can instigate that before we have a tragedy.
Can I just, I'd like to bring Sally next in a moment, because I saw you shaking your head when Mr. Gilruth was speaking earlier, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond. But, I think we're all agreed on the fact that, wildfires are a bad thing. But I believe that a Natural England report in 2020 found that actually 68% of wildfires that had a known cause were initially started by controlled burning, that actually they were controlled burns that ran out of control. And actually, whilst we all agree we don't want wildfires, isn't it the case that sometimes what starts as a controlled fire turns into a wildfire? And so, aren't we basically, wouldn't we all agree that returning these bogs to their natural condition should be aspired to, and that actually controlled burning doesn't in itself mean we never have wildfires?
That figure you just quoted from the Natural England is highly misleading. That, if you check the paperwork, it actually says that is the number of where there's been a wildfire, where we actually attribute and know the cause.
I just said.
Okay, but look at it in relative to the total number of wildfires, and it is a very, very small percentage. And also those fires are the smaller fires. And if you're in the Fire and Rescue Service, and if anybody here gets involved in tackling a wildfire, I can assure you want to be tackling the small fires. Once they become large...
They are wildfires. You do accept that is true, that sometimes controlled burnings run out of control.
They absolutely do, and that is a statistic around the world. Yeah. And actually, both in North America, South America and Europe, they accept that some of those fires may temporarily escape outside the original controlled area. But that's very different from having a large-scale wildfire which is burning down into the peat, which is the very thing we're all trying to protect.
Okay, let me bring you in as next, because we've heard a lot from Mr. Gilruth recently. Do you want to just respond to what you've heard there?
Well, the bit I was wincing about a little bit was the idea that somehow water drains out of the North York Moors, when if that were the case, there would not be any peat bogs on the top of the York Moors.
Yeah.
And it is actually one of our best peat bog systems. There's a lot of work going on with the Yorkshire Peat Partnership to restore the moorlands up there. In fact, the greatest threat to the North York Moors at the moment is the Corderdale Wind Farm project, which is another example, I think, of not very joined up thinking in terms of peatland policy, because the problem there is it takes the extraction of about 8,000 cubic metres per turbine to install a wind farm on a peat bog, and yet under the national planning framework, planning policy framework, we have apparently stopped peat excavation, or the extension of existing permissions to extract peat. Yet suddenly we're allowed to take peat out in order to install wind turbines. So it's those kinds of contradictions which are a real problem in policy at the moment.
Thank you very much. Manuela Pertegala.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm also going to follow from my colleagues. Are there or should be there differences in the management of heathland to moorland, and specifically in relation to peatland? So I'm interested whether different complex landscapes call for different management policies. And if I start with Mr. Gilruth and then to the
This is
panel.
quite far outside of my field of expertise, actually, so I think I'll pass on that one if that's okay.
So in relation to what, in terms of any type of management?
Moorland, heathland, yes.
Well, in relation to some of the points that I've been talking to the committee about in terms of relation to wildfire, we need to pay a great attention, particularly on heathland, though we're not actually protecting the peat underneath, because often it's just gravel. But if you go down to the Dorset heaths, if you go to the Surrey heaths, there are fuel loads now building up in those areas, and that's very close to the urban fringe. And I'm afraid if there's going to be a tragedy, this committee needs to be aware it's most likely that it's going to be in those areas. And we should not take any of this lightly. In Europe, 20 people lost their lives to wildfire. In Los Angeles, it was 30. That was just last year. So we do need things. So in terms of the management on the surface is actually very similar. What's underneath and needs protecting is quite different. Now, the issue you've got down in Dorset on the heath and in Surrey is after the fire, it's just gravel or sand. So you've now got to try and re-establish it. And actually, the National Trust have got issues down in Dorset, actually just trying to get any type of vegetation back again. On the North York Moors, we've lost 5,500 acres. Some of it has burnt all the way through all of the deep peat, and there's no peat left there at all. And remember, this fire was so out of control, the only way the Fire and Rescue Service could get it back under control was to dig a trench using excavators that was 8 metres wide and 29 kilometres long in order to try and contain it. This was a serious wildfire. So please do not think that these are small things. They are very serious.
Yes, thank you. And I don't know if anyone else from the panel wants to come in? No. My second question is about, as the chair has already mentioned, National England evidence. And there is a disputed evidence between landowners and Natural England in relation to the rewetting peatland, so the sphagnum can be restored and can grow in, and then versus the managed burning to combat wildfires. If we accept that that is something that you say is working towards wildfires, we also heard that some of these managed wildfires are getting out of control as well. So I want to say, so can you say a little bit more about that?
Thank you.
Yeah.
So in relation to the evidence, you characterised it as a challenge in between Natural England and landowners, and I appreciate your saying that because I'm sitting here representing landowners. But actually, there's a dispute in between academics and Natural England. And the lead element on that is a study which Natural England actually instigated and DEFRA originally funded for 5 years to answer this exact question. It is currently run by the University of York, and this is the plain English version, I can share it with the committee afterwards, of the 10-year point. And actually, we do have to recognise, and in here, it does actually explain that if you look at it in the short term, when you've had a prescribed burn or controlled winter burn, obviously you get the release of that carbon. But then actually it starts by the time you've got to the 10-year point, you're actually storing more carbon. And you're storing more carbon than if you'd done nothing. And it also has got a higher water table than if you had done nothing. Now, it may be different if we do it, the clock carries on for another 10 years. But this is a live issue around the way Natural England is gathering the evidence. So the evidence review on heather burning, which they published last year, we've talked about that. There's similarly the evidence review which they produced in 2023 on heather cutting. That has been severely challenged in the peer-reviewed scientific literature by academics saying it just doesn't add up. But Natural England have just taken a water off the duck's back approach and said, well, we stuck to our methodology, therefore we are right. But actually academics, not landowners, academics. So that was 2 years ago, we're criticising that in peer-reviewed literature. Natural England has not budged 1 inch on the heather cutting. As night follows day, academics in peer-reviewed literature will be criticising Natural England's review of heather burning. It just takes time. They will do it, I'm sure. And as a result, the question is, how come this keeps happening time and again? With the heather cutting, it didn't involve the fire service and the risk to life. This one does.
Okay, thank you, but do you accept that to restore and promote sphagnum growth, we need to restore water levels?
We need higher water levels, but I think also we need to be honest about some of the best places where you can actually find sphagnum out on the ground. And you can ask the Yorkshire Peat Partnership, because I actually sit on one of their committees, often is areas which were burnt in the previous few years. Because actually they need light. And once the vegetation gets too tall, the sphagnum gets smothered out. So there are always sensitivities to do with this. Nothing is simple. Nothing is simple when it comes to the uplands.
Thank you very much. Sorry, did you want to come back in?
Sally, do you want to
just to say that of our damaged peatlands, only 1% shows signs of sphagnum moss growth. Sphagnum moss is an indicator of healthy, deep peatland. So re-wetting and restoration takes time, and it takes time to restore and recreate it doesn't recreate the peat, as I said, that's a non-renewable resource, but it's certainly in order to start to boost biodiversity, to start to return some of the plant biodiversity back to that environment, it takes time. So sphagnum moss is only an indicator in 1% of the peatlands that there are. I should also point out that sphagnum moss is also absolutely essential to that ecosystem service of preventing flood damage and filtering water and all of those kinds of things. Sphagnum moss is capable of holding 20 times its own weight in water. That's what makes peat bogs, one of the things that makes peat bogs quite so effective as they are in terms of flood prevention. We need sphagnum moss if we are going to allow peat bogs to give us the benefits that they can give us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Samuel Wilson.
Mr. Denny, could I just come back to some of the questions that were asked of you? You had indicated that transitioning from the current usage of peat to alternatives could have an impact on your industry, and you talked about the economic impacts, the competitiveness, etc. Are there any environmental impacts of moving from using peat to using some of the alternatives that you talked about?
The short answer is yes. I can expand on a couple of those, and they are positive and negative. So HCA absolutely accepts the carbon footprint and biodiversity impacts of peat extraction. I'd like to put that there. But it's part of a holistic picture. So I can give an example of one of my members who's transitioning, they're a growing media manufacturer. They're on the journey to transition away from peat-based mixes, and one of the things they've had to do as part of that is invest in wood chip extrusion. Essentially, it uses hammering and heat to convert wood chips into wood fibre. What they've had to do there is obviously increase the energy signature to run the materials, and also wait for quite some time actually for connections to the grid and to water around that. That in itself comes with local kind of costs with planning, etc. So there are economic costs in that respect, but also in that specific example, some carbon impacts. Where the industry has been at the forefront is trying to come up with methods that look at it not so much from the tunnel vision I was talking about we must get rid of peat, through to how do we have that longer journey about what is sustainable growing media. And I use the word sustainable deliberately because all of those alternatives have pros and cons, both in terms of crop production and environmental impacts and social impacts. So where we are as an industry and as an association is we want to take that whole system view of things. We can't move to the extent that the industry collapses and we can no longer produce our own trees and plants. But the fact that we're doing that isn't a get out of jail free card, that we need to take a holistic view of how we're moving the right way sustainably. So yes, there are impacts for most of those alternatives, economic and environmental and social, and all of our members are working to try and minimise those and get on the right path.
I mean, sometimes we make recommendations for the best of reasons. For example, with Draxby Power Station, we decided not to use coal any longer and use wood chip. Mm-hmm. And now we find that it's probably been more environmentally damaging than using coal. I mean, can you see I can think of a plant grower in my own constituency who uses coy. Mm-hmm. But he's concerned about the impact which that is having. Huge amounts. I don't know whether they're done on industrial like plantations, coconut production for the coy, but there's certainly a big increase in that now. I mean, do you see a situation in maybe 20 years' time we look back and say, look at the economic or environmental damage we have done with the alternatives to the... I think you gave the picture, or the figure of 0.07% of peatlands are used for extraction. Is that the correct figure? I mean, do you see could you see a situation where we look back and kick ourselves and think we've done far more environmental damage looking at alternatives?
Interesting question. I would say that the industry is moving in a direction, knowing that there are risks in progress, but there are probably bigger risks in not progressing. So it's a constructive, forward-looking industry. We're alert to those possibilities. We are not looking at this and saying any one of those ingredients is a panacea. To take the point on coir and for the committee, it's essentially coconut farming on plantations, and as a byproduct of the kind of harvesting process, the pith from the residue is packed together and dried, compacted, shipped across, etc. In terms of would we look back and have we done the wrong thing? I think it's why it's so important that things like the responsible sourcing scheme and other life cycle assessment methodologies from Europe are taking a view of all of those materials, what their impacts are, and what continuity of supply is available around those different things. So the industry will learn, more information will become available, and novel materials will come on stream. I highlighted farmed sphagnum. One of my members essentially said that that's basically peat without the 10,000 years attached to it and the carbon impacts. It's not ready at the moment. So the way we would approach growing media is that a kind of tunnel vision around peat ban is the only thing that counts here. That could well be counterproductive, and we've a lot of unintended consequences. Where we need to look at is quite holistically, how are we going to bring on stream ever more sustainable and effective materials. I can, with committee's permission, give one other example of a material around that. You mentioned wood chip. One of the perverse incentives there is renewable energy obligations and contracts for difference, which incentivise the use of wood pellets, keep the price high for again very good reasons. That in turn makes it less accessible for our industry in terms of the price that goes through. Digestate fibre is a huge beneficiary of some of those similar incentives, etc. But if those incentives disappear, then arguably that material is increasingly at risk. So it's really quite a volatile kind of economic and environmental piece here that our industry is having to deal with. It's not a simple case of let's remove peat from the equation and everything's simple. There's a much longer and more complex journey for us in terms of the economics and the environmental impacts, and that's really what our members are trying to wrestle with, is doing the right thing. And as you say, not being able to look back at their staff, their communities, their customers, and have to explain that they got it wrong.
Okay.
And just one last question. I remember the all-party horticultural group. I think we highlight the importance of the horticultural industry to the UK economy. What are you finding your competitors are doing? Are they rushing to transition in the same way as the horticulture industry in the United Kingdom is trying to transition, and indeed are they facing the same kind of threat of regulatory action to make them transition?
Global competitors. Yeah. No, UK industry is leading the way, and leading the way by quite some margin on this. I think I referenced that in the UK professional sector at the moment it's about 35% growing media is made up of peat. I believe in the Netherlands their target for 2025, I might need to correct the figures, but it was around 2/3 that they were pledging to get to. So the UK is significantly ahead of that. That carries cost advantages for our competitors, both the direct cost of materials, but also they're not having to go through that change in terms of how they produce their crops. They're not having to go through that learning curve. They're not having to go through the capital investments to change those things. So our industry is ahead of those things, but it's a very real competitive disadvantage combined with all the other costs of doing business that they're facing into. What they're most afraid of, though, is a level playing field between those competitors. So as our members invest in that transition, as they soak up the costs for that, as they absorb some of the crop losses, what they can't have is that growers from overseas are enabled to have a competitive advantage in terms of the cost by using more peat. So there's a complex international dimension here to make sure that, frankly, this country retains its ability to grow its own plants, its own trees, and the green infrastructure it needs. And that's something we want to really highlight to this committee.
Thank you. We've virtually, we have already expended the time we would have allocated for this session, but there's a couple of last questions we're going to bring in briefly. So firstly, Barry Gardner.
Yes. Mr. Gilruth, I'm keen that we end up here as friends.
Thank you. I'm very keen to.
And that we get some consensus. You urged the committee to look at the science and to look at the world as it is, not as the world that we might like it to be. And we agreed that the government had incentivised in the past the draining of peatlands. I think you would accept that your members did lobby heavily for them to do that. But the key thing now, I suppose, is given what you said about their own desire to re-wet those lands, how many hectares have your members remediated, re-wetted? The peat dams, the plastic piling, the bunding, the drain blocking that needs to go on. How many hectares have your members actually done to show what you said was their intent, that we should get back to a restored peatland? How about taking some of the livestock off the land, that were causing damage and so on? So that's my last question to you.
Well, thank you. And with your permission, I'll come back with the exact number. I'm afraid of all the numbers I brought with me, I'm afraid that isn't one that I got sitting in front of me. But that is important, and I might, if I may, in the spirit of making sure that we all leave here as friends, make sure that the condition assessments actually up on the moors and what condition that they're in, we need to be careful and understand that just using land-based aerial photography and assuming that gives us, and using land management as a proxy for harm, we have to be careful about how that gets interpreted. And actually, there is no substitute for actual on-site inspections.
But on-site inspections are very difficult. It's remote land and to cover the areas. But we do now have, since May last year, we do have the England peat map. You said there hadn't been mapping done, but of course that was done in May of last year.
Sorry, thank you. The England peat map, and that is a map, but it doesn't tell you which areas are suitable for actual re-wetting programmes and which are not. That work still hasn't been worked out, and I think we've agreed as a committee, or sorry, the words in Jerome Males, but that is something which perhaps could be looked into. But actually, I might just push back a little bit. We do have a statutory system of SSI units to actually go and inspect. I'm afraid that is woefully behind, and that would be for the next session to perhaps delve into. But the most recent...
Only up to 8%. Is it 8% or 12% now? It used to be 6% had been inspected in the past 5 years. But, I mean, SSIs are, in effect, not with the name that...
You might want to speak to the committee may want to speak to the officials about why that is so, because it is actually a requirement.
We have on many occasions.
If we delve back into...
If I could just interrupt for a minute, you two, and just bring in Chris Hinchliffe now.
Thank you, Chair. Again, Mr. Gilruth, I'm also sort of grasping for opportunity to end on a positive note here.
Thank you.
And I think that seemed to me like there was agreement that we broadly, where possible, want to see the water table rising on deep peat and returning to blanket bog. And you've set out that you believe there is scientific evidence that actually vegetation burning can contribute towards that objective. And I was just looking back at the sort of derogations that exist within the legislation. And as I understand it, there is an exception to the bans on burning where there is a provable conservation benefit, and there are derogations where burning can still be carried out on where the land is on a steep slope, and you've referred to concerns around hills. I just wondered whether there was anything further you would recommend in terms of derogations to help, in your view, your members use that burning method to move towards, in the longer term, appreciating, as you said, 50 years to get towards wetter peat and blanket bog.
Well, thank you. You've certainly given me a gift, and we'll leave here hugging each other if you manage to persuade in the next session that actually the system which you've just described was actually made workable. So to be able to illustrate that to committee, the implementation of what I call a de facto ban, you refer to it in the committee notes as a ban, actually of all the licence applications which have gone in relation to, since that regulation came in, not a single one has been issued. So we're talking about a fairly hard-hitting application of the handbrake. And that has to be a concern to this committee. Right now, there is only one licence in England which has been issued, is signed off personally by the minister to be able to burn. It's a 2-year licence, and in 10 days' time, it's going to expire, and it will never have been used because it has a condition attached to it which nobody can satisfy. The estate has put in, it has been required to put in to satisfy Natural England that there'll be less burning will be required again in the future. They have taken 5 submissions to Natural England in terms of management plans so that it can get that condition addressed so that they can actually strike a match. In order, because the minister has been satisfied for wildfire risk, not for conservation, just for wildfire risk, there is a real risk, and this is the only way to deal with it. So for 2 years that risk has existed. It is still there today. The landowner can't use it because it's got this additional condition, and nobody can find a way of satisfying it, and the licence is just about to expire. So there's only one licence in England which is currently available. So this if you like, conscription, if there was an approach, and you talked about in Scotland, then, and you quite rightly said, actually, they're still looking at introducing regulation. Let's be clear, one of the reasons they wanted to delay the implementation of the regulation in Scotland is because they realised after the significant fire in southern Scotland that actually they did not want to lose the capability of being able to tackle fires, because the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service pleaded that there is no way that we need the farmers and gamekeepers to get rid of their firefighting equipment in terms of that they use for the controlled burning. And these are the individuals which know how to work with fire. You've got to remember on the North York Moors, the only people which did the back burning to help the Fire and Rescue Service were the gamekeepers because they felt confident about how to use it. And bear in mind, they had one of Donald Trump's listening posts just behind them. If they messed up, they would have been on the front page of every newspaper. And they could not make a mistake. So they had to get it right. So these skills need to be kept on the land. And if you go to Europe, the firefighters there will tell you, please don't ask me how much equipment I want. What I need is I need people back on the land managing the fuel loads. Please don't just keep asking me what firefighting equipment. Right. Thank you, Chair. I know you need to move on.
Okay, thank you. So, Mr. Denny, I just wanted to ask you, we heard Ms. Nex's frustration with the fact that government haven't got on and legislated in the way that this and previous governments have suggested they would. You said that your members would welcome certainty. We've been through lots of the different complications, but I just wanted to check with you. It is not your organisation that is asking the government to have this delay. If we ask the Minister next week, why aren't you getting on with this? She's not going to come and say, well, the Horticultural Association asked us to delay because of the impact on their members. Can you just assure us on that?
Yeah, I mean, our policy paper is freely available on our website. Yeah, we're in favour of a peat-free future for horticulture. We think for the majority of our retail members, the end of 2028 should be achievable, and that for professional, with a few caveats and exemptions, the end of 2030 should be achievable for the majority. So what we're asking for DEFRA is the manageable time to help with the regulatory unlockers to make that a success. So that's our position.
Yeah, and Ms. Nex, I mean, you came here strongly arguing for this ban on the sale of horticultural peat. The sessions also reflected heavily on the issue of burning, which was not so much a sort of a priority that you outlined. I mean, is there just anything else you want to respond to all that we've heard on the issue of burning?
There's just one thing actually I'd like to come back on what you were saying. I actually sit on the responsible sourcing scheme, which I think David referred to. There is such a lot of work going on in the horticultural industry to address exactly the problem that you're talking about, to make sure that we do not replace peat with something that is environmentally more harmful. They have gone to an enormous amount of trouble to assess every single possible ingredient that might be used as an alternative to peat. That exists at the moment. I do appreciate there are novel ingredients coming down the road. But they have looked at it from every angle, and they are giving them values so that we can be sure that any future peat-free compost that you buy is not environmentally, obviously everything has an environmental impact, but is not more environmentally damaging than peat. Even coir, which we recognise has its quite serious difficulties and drawbacks, even coir comes out considerably less damaging than extracting peat for horticulture, the extracted peat, the use of that for horticulture. So the figure's very clear on that one. With coir, a number of organisations, including Westland Horticulture, which is the biggest producer of compost in the UK, has a policy of being coir-free as well as peat-free in the future. So that is the direction of travel. Quite a lot of the new kind of peat-free startups that you'll find, the compost manufacturers, are actually deliberately starting out without coir in the first place. So I might point out also that most of the alternatives, it's sort of been pointed out already, but most of the alternatives to peat are also derived from the circular economy, so that's very much feeding into the government's policy of encouraging the circular economy. They are also sourced from within the UK, so you are not quite so dependent on really quite volatile imported sources of peat. 60% of our peat, as I said, is imported at the moment for horticulture. That has to be trucked up to 1,600 miles across Europe in order to get to us. Yeah. Obviously,
just come back to that question. On the question of burning, your members, do you have sort of a contradictory view on the benefits of burning? Or are you really just focused on horticultural sales?
Mainly focused on horticultural peat. Okay. We work with a lot of our partners who do indeed address things like burning. We work with the IUCN, for example. But yes, my main focus is on horticultural peat.
Understand. Sure. And finally, Mr. Gilruth, I'm conscious that the Moorland Association had a legal challenge to the UK government's restrictions, sort of defeated in court. Were you clear on why the courts found against you on that?
Thank you, Chair. So that was a permission hearing, and at that hearing, the judge did not support proceeding to a full hearing, and that matters now at the Court of Appeal. We feel, as I mentioned at the beginning, the fact that the Minister had a meeting with a Category 1 responder and with the fire chiefs, and there are no minutes and there's no takeout and no record, and you'll also be aware, because I shared it just before this meeting, that in response to a parliamentary question this morning, that DEFRA have said that was a mistake, it was an error. So actually I think that we probably shouldn't be discussing it too much further, okay. But if I may, and come back right at the beginning, we were talking about, if you like, the state of our peatlands, and Mr. Gardner was quite clear about actually the SSSI inspections are running woefully behind. But if we look at where they were, and so look at the JNCC report from 2011.
I think we're moving way beyond the question I've asked you. I just wanted to finally get your response to that. I wasn't aware that you were appealing on that, so I think there's nothing more to say.
That's a matter of public record, Chair.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Well, listen, thank you to all three of you for your evidence. It's been a longer session than we anticipated, but I think a very thorough one. And we're extremely grateful to all three of you for sparing your time and clearly the research that's gone into providing the evidence you have today. So we'll bring this first panel to a close with eager anticipation of the next one. And with that, I'll very briefly adjourn. This sitting is suspended. Order. To order. Well, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the second session of our one-off review into peatlands and the impact of government policy on them. And we have in front of us now a panel representing Natural England, DEFRA and the Environment Agency. I don't know if the three of you were all present in the session that's just gone before, but it's give us all plenty to consider, and we're very grateful to you for attending this session. If I could start by just asking the three of you to introduce yourselves, your organisations, and your role in peatland preservation and policy. So let's start with you, Mr. Rockliff, if I may.
Hello, so Craig Rockliff. I'm the Head of Nature Data Regulation and also Peatland Management in the Environment Agency. Our role there has been working on delivering the grant schemes for discovery pilots, working with local communities, local farmers and landowners to develop communities to actually encourage the development of sustainable management of peat. We also provide additional support for upland management. We're here today because of the level of water and the role that water plays in peat, as you've probably heard from previous session. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And next to yourself, please, Miss Edwards.
Hi, so I'm Gabrielle Edwards. I'm Deputy Director for Access Landscape, Peat and Soils in DEFRA. So peat policy is part of my job. So I lead the team that has overall responsibility for peat policy, but also for developing the programme which spends money to deliver the targets on peat restoration, and also the legislative work around heather and grass burning, which you've obviously just heard a lot about, and we also run the licensing and enforcement function around the heather and grass burning regulations as well.
Yeah, and then yourself, Mr. Law.
So I'm Alan Law. I'm Chief Officer for Operations at Natural England. My teams deal with the frontline services, if you like, so working with landowners, developers, local planning authorities and the like, around site management, site regulation, species licensing, and that range of matters, and also, importantly here, agri-environment scheme advice.
I'll come back to you in a moment, Mr. Law, but obviously, Miss Edwards, you will have heard in the previous session Mr. Gilruth from the Moorland Association particularly critical of the advice that DEFRA officers have provided to ministers. I mean, specifically the charge of misleading ministers on this. I mean, just give you an opportunity before we get into the bones of the issue to just respond to what you heard. Are you content that ministers have not been misled on this matter?
I'm completely content on that, and I did sit through that session, and I heard what Mr. Gilruth said. I mean, just to kind of say two things. The first thing is that the advice the advice to ministers around heather and grass burning covered a whole range of issues, including looking at the scientific advice, which was based on advice from Natural England and an evidence review they concluded, which Alan might want to talk about, but also covered the responses from the consultation exercise, which we'd undertaken, and we had a lot of responses to that, including, as he said, from the Fire and Rescue Service. It included economic advice. And so, as far as we're concerned, ministers had an extremely balanced package of advice, and it's probably worth saying that was crawled over through the judicial review that was referred to. The part of the grounds that were brought against the government in that were that ministers had not taken a decision that they could justify, that they hadn't given conscious consideration to the issues, and the judge ruled very clearly that none of those grounds were arguable. Now, that's clearly subject to appeal, but, it was a very clear ruling by the judge. So, I would just stand by the fact that those issues were gone over in court. But I might want to say something about the Natural England Evidence Review, because that's the thing in particular that Mr Gilruth was pushing back on so hard.
Okay, well, I'll give you an opportunity, Mr Law, on that, and then we'll get into the bones of the matter.
So I wasn't here for Mr Gilruth's session,
right.
But in terms of
you might want to get it on catch-up.
In terms of the evidence review, we undertook a detailed evidence review in 2013-14, which has been published, and we more recently undertook an update to that review, so doing a literature review in particular to look at new information that had come to light and bringing that piece of advice up to date. I'm quite happy if the committee would like us to provide this committee with a summary or indeed the full evidence review content. So,
well, I think the particular charge was that the claim of a rigorous peer review was at best exaggerated, and that actually that not all of the reviewers actually effectively it hadn't had a rigorous peer review. That one said they hadn't read it end to end, another said the brain couldn't keep track. That effectively it wasn't a rigorously peer reviewed document.
So, my understanding, it was conducted fully in line with our published guidance around evidence reviews, and we will be responding to Mr Gilruth in full in terms of his questions on the matter. Okay,
well, that's fine. Well, let's get into the detail of the condition of England's peat then, and if I could start with you, Mr Law. I mean, how would you describe the condition of England's peatland, and how is that monitored?
Well, the first thing to say about England's peatland is we've got a large proportion, a significant proportion of the world's resource of peatland. As the committee will know, peatlands are enormously valuable resources. They take thousands of years to develop. They're valuable in their own right for the wildlife and the carbon that they store, but they're also enormously valuable for people, and they're part of the real infrastructure of this country. So something approaching 70% of the drinking water that we receive comes via peaty soils. That's not surprising, because these are areas that have high amounts of rainfall or water capture. So they're really important for providing water management, so be that drinking water supply, flood risk management, water quality. Sadly, although we have a large extent, the IUCN estimates that over 90% of that's currently in a degraded condition. Degraded means it is not functioning, so it's not delivering those services that I described for nature or for people. It can be releasing carbon, so what we have with peatlands is one of the most effective means of carbon capture. Compared with other natural means of carbon capture, peatlands lock carbon away in perpetuity, whereas trees, for example, take carbon out of the atmosphere, but very often that'll be released again within a relatively short period of time. Peatland locks it away permanently. So degraded peatlands are a matter of real concern because not only are they not serving the purpose they could be, which is helping us fight the challenge of climate change, they're actually adding to the problem by releasing at accelerated rates very large amounts of stored carbon.
And I mean, in terms of the monitoring, how adequate do you think the full extent of knowledge of that degradation is? Are you pretty confident about the quality of our monitoring?
So a significant proportion of peatlands are designated as sites of special scientific interest. They receive a monitoring programme. Now, that monitoring programme is nothing like as up to date as we might wish it to be. Simply because the volume of work associated with undertaking site condition assessments is beyond the resources available to us right now.
And what are the commitments that Natural England have legally or on sites of monitoring of sites of special scientific interest, and how were you actually performing against those with the resources that
so there are EIP targets around getting information around the state of SSIs and to inform management advice. The gold standard that's currently in operation around what's called common standards monitoring for SSIs is a very onerous level, and we are looking at how we can reform and simplify that monitoring regime so that we can get the information that we need around site condition to inform site management and to work with the relevant landowners without going through quite such an exhaustive process on every occasion.
So at the moment, the government, through the EIP, have a particular set of expectations, and your response to that is we should reduce those expectations?
No, we're not reducing those expectations. We're working with government to deliver the expectations that government have set us. So
aren't you saying that they will be achieved by monitoring less? Is that not what you're saying?
Not by monitoring less, but by monitoring differently. Right. So the gold standard monitoring regime, common standards monitoring, is based on an assessment of features that are defined at the time of notification of a site of special scientific interest. Those features change over time. So there are interest features of sites now that were not present at the time of notification. Similarly, the function of SSIs needs to be understood in the context of the wider landscape. The idea that you manage SSIs in isolation from the wider ecosystem that they belong in is one that is archaic, and you know, we need a modernised monitoring regime that enables us to cope with that.
So, I mean, in terms of monitoring, I mean, you referred to a big proportion of England's peatlands being within SSIs, and that therefore they should, by definition, be better monitored. But I think we heard earlier only about 6% of SSIs actually are monitored. So, I mean, how much of confidence should we take from the fact that, well, don't worry, these are in SSIs?
It's not that they're not monitored. So we undertake site checks. The gold standard, common standards monitoring, is a very onerous exercise. So
unreasonably, do you think?
I think it needs modernising, yes. And we have explored with DEFRA how we might undertake that in spending review discussions.
Okay. And then
we do site checks on these sites, so it is not the case that they're not visited by people, and we are able to discern where a more in-depth monitoring visit is required, or indeed where adjustments to management is required.
But in terms of the figures you've given us, around 90% of peatlands being degraded, you can be pretty confident that that's accurate.
Our evidence shows of SSIs, we reckon that 85% are in an unfavourable condition. Now, a significant proportion of that of those SSIs are in a recovering condition, because we're talking about a habitat type that can take decades, even with all the right management in place, to be fully restored.
They're starting to improve.
They're starting to improve.
And in terms of that restoration of peatlands, is that monitored in a different way, or is it basically the same thing?
So the SSIs will be monitored through our site visits and common standards monitoring where appropriate. There is also a monitoring protocol that's being developed with DEFRA in relation to peatland grant scheme restoration, so a 4-stage categorisation with works undertaken to, first of all, stem causes of decline, then put in place the means of active management, and then monitor the move through to stage 4, which is a thriving and recovering peatland.
Thank you very much. Sergeant Joseph.
Thank you, Chair. Gabrielle, if I can come to you first. We heard from the previous panel the evidence on the use of horticultural peat and the impact of government's proposed ban, including the economic cost, also leaving horticultural industry in limbo because of the uncertainty what's going to happen, and no one is investing due to that uncertainty. So could you provide an update on where we are in reducing the use of peat and on the necessary legislation to take this forward?
The position on legislation is the one that was set out in the Environmental Improvement Plan, which was discussed in the last session, which is that this government is committed to legislate when parliamentary time allows. As the witness from the Peat-free partnership said, we've agreed with the devolved governments that we are going to do some work on, how we kind of now move that forward. What's the timetable to move it forward? How do we move towards joint legislation? Because I think we're all agreed that legislating on a UK-wide basis for this is by far the best way forward. There will be some very difficult internal market issues if that wasn't the case. So there is work to be done because this is not a straightforward piece of legislation, and we will move that forward. But I can't say more than that broad commitment about when parliamentary time allows. I think what is important though is to think about, as I think became clear through that previous session, that the transition to a more sustainable market here is actually quite a broad-ranging and complex thing. We can legislate, and that is an important part of what we're trying to do, but we also need to change demand, and we are starting to see quite a significant shift in the market. I think anyone who's been to a garden centre over the last few years will have seen an awful lot more of kind of peat-free produce, which is there available for customers, partly because there's a wish to kind of change, but also because of the market demand. Over the last kind of 8 years, we've seen about a 64% reduction in the amount of peat that is being kind of sold through the system. So legislation is part of the picture, but it's only part of the picture, and we need both that kind of market pull and also the changes that were being talked about by the witness, for example, from the HTA, around really kind of supporting that kind of evidence work to ensure that people kind of understand what the impact of alternatives would be and the impact of that change, what the economics are, and what the different options are and the kind of the pros and cons. So we carry on supporting work around the evidence base to make sure that as we develop legislation, we're kind of doing that in the best way possible, and also to support both growers and suppliers of alternative growing medium in making that transition.
Thank you. Just want to clarify, does ministers and department acknowledge the concerns raised by the industry about the uncertainty and that is putting them not able to invest in any new plans? Does the ministers and department acknowledge their concern?
We've certainly heard that message extremely strongly through from the industry that they would like certainty, and I can't disagree with that, and that's why there is a commitment in place to try and move to legislation, but also to make that broader environment more certain, to enable people to have the confidence to kind of make the shift.
Thank you. So if I can move on to the next topic. Again, we heard from the previous panel about the impact of government's extended ban on the burning of peatlands. As the chair said about, we heard the DEFRA is isolated on this and don't know the depth of the problems. The controlled burning can help with wildfire. Is there any evidences around in the G7 countries where this is successfully implemented that stopping the controlled burning can help? So can you tell us, is the extension of the ban being adhered to, and do you still think your level of ambition was justified?
I mean, there's a lot in that question. So this has been a journey that we've been on for a number of years. I mean, we started with a voluntary approach, and that didn't work. We were not getting kind of the move away from using rotational burning as a standard management technique in the uplands. That was not delivering the benefits for protection of the peatlands that we needed to see. So, we went through a voluntary approach. We went then into a more limited regulatory approach, which was very much focused on stopping burning in SSSIs. And now we've moved to a kind of a broader approach across the upland and on deeper peat. So this has been a very long signalled transition. I'd also stress that this is not a ban. It is a ban subject to a licensing regime. And, I fully accept what Mr Gilruth was saying, that not many licences have been issued.
Not many or not?
Not
just one?
Many.
Just one?
No, there were licences issued under the 2021 regime, a very small number. And as he said, there has been one particular licence, and, probably shouldn't go into the details of a particular licence, but where we have given those applicants and licence holders a huge amount of assistance, as have my colleagues in Natural England, in trying to fulfil the conditions of that licence, but they still haven't managed to do it. The new regulations only came in September. We have had, I think it's 15 licence applications under that system, and actually, despite what Mr Gilruth said, actually we have now issued the first decisions under that licensing regime. So
you've approved some of those, have you?
No, we've declined them.
Right.
We've declined the applications.
You're saying, well, there's not a ban, there's a licensing arrangement, but actually nobody has successfully come through that licensing arrangement. So, I mean, it's not far off a ban, is it?
Well, what we've tried to do with the new arrangements is to provide more assistance to applicants, because, I mean, we fully accept that there will be circumstances in which burning may be the right solution. So there may be some areas where cutting doesn't work because of the kind of the nature of the land, kind of slopes, or if there's historic features or something like that. And there may be circumstances in which it is a suitable approach for tackling some of the wildfire risk. That does not mean that using it as a standard management tool on a rotational basis is necessarily the right approach to go through. So we think it is possible, and we look at every licence application on its merits. We've provided more support through a revised heather and grass burning code, grass management code. We've provided standard templates, easier application forms to use. We've streamlined our application system to try and enable us to deal with licence applications on as rapid a process as possible. So, we would fully expect that if, a good application came in that met the conditions, we will issue a licence. And, we're still looking at licences, applications that have come in what is still a very new system. It only came in at the start of September.
Sorry, did you have further questions?
Yeah, just to clarify, is there any evidence, especially within the G7 countries, anywhere this is successfully implemented?
I think it's very hard to draw some of those comparisons because, as I think Alan said earlier, we've got a lot more peat than most other people. So, there is a big difference between using a fire, burning as a way of managing a vegetation control when you've got a risk of getting fire into a deep peat, for all the reasons that Mr Gilruth set out about the length of time that it can carry on burning in there, and it may be it may be a more reasonable management technique if you're not using it on deep peat. So I think it's really hard to make comparisons about the position on particular areas of moorland in England as against what might be happening in Spain or in Canada.
Can I come in, Chair? So this is contextual, really. So it's really important to understand where we have fire risk and fire practice on blanket bog, on peatlands, is where there is an excess of dry surface vegetation. It's that dry surface vegetation that burns and burns first, and it's only when that gets too hot that it gets into the peat. The reason we have surplus dry surface vegetation is because of land management changes really over the last 60 years that have involved a combination of drainage, excess grazing, and of a relatively recent massive uptick in the amount of rotational burning that's been undertaken on these moors. So what those have led to is areas of heather dominance and areas of Molinia dominance. That is the vegetation that's driving this. The best way to tackle that is to re-wet those habitats because wet sponges don't burn. And so in no way would we say that in no circumstances ever would rotational burning or localised burning be something that might be appropriate. I think a sweeping one-size-fits-all answer isn't the right one. But the best way to get these habitats back into good condition, to tackle wildfire risk and deliver all the range of other services, is to re-wet them.
Okay, thank you very much. Are you okay with that? Yep.
Just a quick one follow on. Then we heard from the panel earlier, the expert saying that re-wetting can't prevent wildfire. I don't know if you have any evidences to suggest.
So we are experiencing climate change. Climate change will lead to changes in rainfall patterns in some of these areas, longer, drier summers. Could we say categorically that is not going to lead to increased wildfire risk on peatlands? No, I don't know. No, we could not. So is there the potential for using some forms of surface management which might involve burning? Might that be appropriate in some cases? Possibly. And the licensing regime is there designed to bring forward that evidence, but it's not there as a vehicle for simply trying to persist with outdated forms of land management under the guise of dealing with fire risk.
Can I just very quickly add to that? I mean, I think, again, we would not disagree with Mr. Gilruth that re-wetting takes time and re-establishing these functioning peat bogs takes time. And, managing that transition and managing some of the risks through that transition is something that we are all, interested in and concerned about. And that's why sort of changing some of these land management practices and, and thinking about, when licensing for burning might be sensible to help with that is something that, I think is really important. The other thing I think I would just say is that in the end, it is not re-wetting peat bogs that causes wildfire. All sorts of things will cause wildfire. If you look at the report about the Fylingdales incident, they think it was caused by a camper in a forest, with a gas stove or something like that.
But if there had been controlled burning in advance of that, then might that not have happened? We accept that wetting doesn't cause fires, but does the approach and the lack of controlled burning make it more vulnerable to that camper?
I think, if we have, where we have re-wetted peatlands, the risk is lower.
Yeah. I don't think you're saying anything that anyone's disputing.
We can't say that it will never get into the deep peat, because obviously that's what we saw.
With respect, that's not the question I asked you, was it? The question I asked you was, if in the case of that camper, if there had been controlled burning in advance of that, would that have reduced the risk?
I think it was in a forest, so you wouldn't have conducted controlled burning in a forest. We don't know. We don't know if there had been controlled burning in a particular
maybe putting
area.
that case to one side, do you accept that controlled burning does reduce the risk in comparison to not doing it or not?
Not necessarily, because there are other ways to keep the vegetation down. You can cut. You don't have to control. It is not a question of you either have a fuel load from vegetation or you burn. There are a range of practices you can use to reduce that fuel load, and how you combine that with kind of re-wetting, I think, is really, really important.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Let me bring Barry Gardner in.
Thank you, Chair. Look, I'm struggling with the figures here, right? Because the EIP, the Environmental Improvement Plan, pledged 85 million by 2030. and said that 40,000 hectares should be restored by April 2030. The Nature for Climate Fund said that there was 50 million from that, and they were looking to add that to the pot by 2027. But CB7, Carbon Budget 7, says that we will have done 6,900 hectares restoration by 2025, i.e. last year, and 7,943 by 2030, and 9,208 by 2035. How much money do we actually have, and how much restoration have we actually done?
Okay. I agree with you. That is an absolute super figures. Can I try and take you through it and sort of my understanding of it? So, the headline target is that we are, which was the one that was set out in the EIP.
280,000 by 2050, and it's commitment 63 of the EIP, as we know.
So that's 280,000 hectares by 2050. And then if you try and break that down, so between 2020 and 2026, we think we have delivered 28,000 hectares. We then have a target between 2020...
Sorry, I want all that you're just about to give me, but if that's the case, why on earth has CB Carbon Budget 7 said that we'd have 6,900 by now?
I think everyone's always just kind of calculating different fractions, different baselines, different things that are being delivered by different pots of money, and some of it will be linked.
This is peatland restoration. I mean, this hectares of peatland restoration. This isn't emissions or different calculations of it. I don't understand why the Committee on Climate Change would have said that by 2030, they say 7,943 if we've already done 28,000.
They, I assume, are talking about a small amount potentially being delivered through a pot of money. I don't know the specific
Can you write
reference.
to us? Because we do need clarity on this.
We will write to you.
We really do need clarity, because if one arm of government is saying something and another, well, the CCC, in fairness, is not an arm of government, but they are the advisor to government, is saying something that is so out of sync, it doesn't seem right.
Yeah. I mean, I think there is actually a kind of clear path through it. If you look at 2020 to 26, what we expect to do in 2026 to 2030, and then what the residual is between 2030 and 2050 to get to that 280,000.
So give me those figures as well, please.
So 2020 to 2026, we have delivered 28,000 hectares.
Yeah.
2026 to 2030, we expect to deliver 40,000 hectares, and then that leaves 211,000 hectares between 2030 and 2050.
It doesn't, because it's 280,000, it's not 250,000.
It's 250.
No.
It is. It's 28 plus 40 plus 211 gets you pretty much to 280.
Sorry. Apologies, yes. So the 40,000 is within that time period. It's additional to the 28.
Yes. So the
40,000. I didn't realise that.
40,000 is what we expect to fund, essentially with the pot of money we got from the spending review, which is the £85 million you referred to. Yep. And that is money to spend on a whole range of things, some of which is peatland restoration. And I should say that the £85 million, just to complicate things further, doesn't necessarily cover the entire spend, because that only includes peatland restoration for a year, because after that we're expecting the funding to come through the Landscape Recovery Scheme. The vast majority for the 2026-2030 period is for something actually which we haven't discussed at all today, which is the lowland peat restoration.
Well, I was just coming to that.
And there's money there which is around support for the Peatland Code and Horticultural trials and more research and evidence and all sorts of very
What progress have you made so far in implementing the recommendations of the Lowland Agricultural Peat Task Force?
Right, the Lowland Agricultural. So, we've been talking a lot about upland peat restoration and how difficult that is, and how you're trying to turn around large periods of time of land management. let's now think about the lowlands when we're basically going back to the 17th century and the draining of some of the lowlands and having to really seriously think how we manage water resources in those sort of areas. So, this is a really big job. And actually, this is the really big prize because we know that, for example, that the lowland agricultural peatlands are responsible for 88% of our peatlands emissions. So really, really challenging, but absolutely critical. And
there's a fight here with agriculture, isn't there?
It's not a fight, but it's a transition. So over the last few years since the task force, which was really important for shaping the programme, I would say we've very much been in kind of a discovery and research and partnership building phase. So we've done quite a lot of work building partnerships around how you bring people together within a catchment, because this is not an area where a landowner can on their own decide to make a change. These are complex water management systems, which I'm sure Craig will be able to kind of talk you through.
The Dutch have been doing this for years, haven't they? You said earlier, well, we've got a lot more peat than other people, but we haven't actually. We've got 41,000, and the Canadians have got 1.1 million.
We've certainly been looking at what's been going on in the Netherlands, and that has also helped shape our programme. So we've been doing partnership building. We've been thinking about the sort of infrastructure changes that you need to introduce. We've been thinking about and supporting farmers around starting to make that transition. So trialling paludiculture, kind of the wetter farming crops, putting in place improved incentives for farmers through the countryside stewardship hire tier scheme, and doing kind of research and evidence around the economics, some of the social issues, some of the agronomy, which will enable us then to build on that for a much more extensive programme of interventions and support in the period that we're talking through up to 2030.
So my question was, what progress has been made in implementing the recommendations? What you've said is that we've been getting people together to try and do the sort of coordinated land management that is required. What progress has been made?
So, those projects are directed at implementing the recommendations. So it's very much about, as I said, reforming the way the water system works.
I know what it's about. Sorry, I'm being really mean to you because I'm asking you to be specific and not just give me
if you'd like me to,
a sweetie wrapper answer.
Okay, if you'd like me to go through a blow-by-blow response to where we are on the task force recommendations, we'll have to come back to you on that. Clearly it was a report issued under the last government, and we used that to shape a whole programme of work. And I can talk to you about that, but what I can't do is say this recommendation.
Let's accept a written. Yeah. Very briefly, going back to what we were talking about before, Mr. Law, you talked about a modernised monitoring regime, but you also said that 80% were in unfavourable condition. Now, you said that the monitoring regime that had been in place was, you said, the 6% or 8 or 12%, whichever it is, of SSSIs not being monitored wasn't correct, because those sites were being visited, and where necessary they were then being monitored more carefully. If that had been the case, surely 80% of sites would not have been in unfavourable condition.
85% of sites are in unfavourable condition. I'll need to get you the exact breakdown, but a significant proportion of that 85% is what we term recovering. So that means it is under the right management regime to get to a state of favourable condition. With peatlands, and a bit like ancient woodlands, these habitats take a very long time once they're degraded to get back. So you can do everything that you need to do on them, but it still takes decades to get to a favourable condition.
Okay. Thank you. I think that's a helpful clarification. And the final question I had, I think, is probably for you, Mr. Ruskell, and that is two parts. Do you agree that the controlled burns raise the water table, which is what Mr. Gilruth suggested to the committee? He said that the evidence was that the controlled burns actually raised the water table?
I made a note of that myself, and it was something I was not aware of. When I visited these sites after there have been burns, I have seen those areas where they are wetted, or the water table is closer to the surface. They have survived the burns in much better condition. I don't know specifically about that example.
Well, could you?
Yep, we will look
into
it
a bit further and write to us. And the other question, I suppose, is we rehearsed the argument about why and you were there, so you heard it all, why government had incentivised the draining of the moorlands. Why is it that the Moorland Association, do you think, are so keen to have what they call controlled burning? Why don't they prefer cutting to burning? Why don't they prefer other ways of controlling the surface vegetation, which is liable to wildfires, or susceptible to wildfires? And is that because of the way in which the heather management produces those little green shoots that are so helpful for grouse?
Well, I can't answer that directly, I'm afraid. I'll let my colleagues... However, what I can say is that we do know that if we restore our upland peatland areas to their truly functioning hydrological nature, where they're wetter, they reduce flood risk, they improve the water quality that runs off them, they increase the storage of water, and they do contribute to reducing the elements of wildfires. But the specifics that you've asked, I'm afraid I'm going to pass over.
Mr. Law, you look keen to interject at this point.
So when you burn heather, you get a fresh flush of new growth, and the grouse feed on it. The grouse feed on it, and when you have a combination of long heather, which can be good for nesting in, and then short heather, which can be good for feeding, you get a nice mix, which gamekeepers like. However, I have been on countless moorlands with gamekeepers and shown them pristine, good functioning blanket bog, and there's an aha moment when they see that, because what you get with blanket bog is with the water levels raised, you get those small tips of fresh growth poking out through the moss, and actually the gamekeepers will say, aha, that is actually perfect for grouse. The question is the transition. Well, the question is, in one, that transition, and two, changes in what have become, albeit quite short term, but cultural practices. If people are wedded to a certain management regime that works for them, and grouse bags have been very elevated over the last 40 years through a combination of medicated grits and intensive burning, people are used to that as a means of yielding grouse. Switching to something that involves a long-term land management change is difficult. But it does work, and there are moorland owners who have done it and demonstrated it.
Thank you very much.
Move on. Thank you, Carla Denny.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm going to return to lowlands. As was remarked, we've spent much less time on that, even though it is very important. So the chair of the Lowland Agricultural Peat Task Force said in their report that if vast areas of peat are to be re-wetted in the lowlands, then the key questions for government are: what is the likely impact on our domestic food supply, and what is the risk of us needing to import more food from overseas, and the carbon emissions that would arise from that? So my questions for probably initially Gabrielle, but whoever wants to come in, is how can the risks to food security and emissions from re-wetting lowland peatlands be addressed, and how can we be sure that we're having a net benefit?
Okay. So I'll start off coming at it from a slightly different angle, which is that let's not assume that business as usual actually is an option, because these heavily farmed and very productive historically peatlands are degrading and eroding, and as a food security issue that has been, flagged, that in the long term, that high quality soil is simply not going to be there.
Yeah.
So some sort of transition is going to be needed regardless. And, I think we all accept that moving to farming on re-wetted land is a tricky transition. It requires thinking in a different way about some of the crops that are burnt. I'm obsessed with burning now. Some of the crops that are grown, and some of that might be quite different. Thinking about growing fibre, for example, rather than growing kind of standard kind of vegetable crops, and potentially some of that could be lower yields, lower productivity, and so that's why we're thinking about some of that through the countryside stewardship scheme. So you actually do incentivise and try and think about what's the balance of incentives for those farmers. We have done some analysis about what the impact of peatland restoration could be on food production, because we do know that there are some specialist crops that are disproportionately grown in some of those lowland peat areas, so things like celery and radish and green beans and lettuce and onions and leeks, and these are important for domestic supply. So if they're not grown on peat, they would need to be grown somewhere else, or, as you say, potentially imported. But kind of relative to the overall kind of percentage of kind of the UK domestic supply, it's not enormous. So I don't think we would see this as being a huge threat to food security, but there are threats there even if you're not thinking about re-wetting the peat. So I think really kind of quite interesting to see how some of the trials go about what it is you can grow on some of the kind of re-wetted areas, how far you can still grow different vegetable crops, even if you perhaps can't grow some of the traditional kind of root crops, how those markets for fibre start to grow. And, there are other things, and we've been been some trials, for example, actually even for rice growing. I'm not suggesting that's going to be a kind of a big solution, but just kind of thinking in a different way about what you can grow on re-wetted soils. And this is tricky.
Yeah, I'm aware of the range of potential alternatives that you could grow on re-wetted lowland peat, and the argument, for example, for reeds for thatch. Obviously not a huge proportion of our housing stock is thatched, but it seems wild that of that is thatched, most of it is from imported material, when why on earth aren't we growing that ourselves? So there are some things that are no-brainers to me, but I guess my question was more specifically on or largely on food security. And I agree that as soil quality declines, we've got a food security problem already coming down the track at us, whether we like it or not. But I'm concerned to make sure that changes to lowland peat soils don't make that worse, at least, and whether there's been an assessment of whether the changes could make it worse or whether it would make it better than where we're heading anyway. Do you see what I mean?
Not I would say at a sort of system-wide level. What you tend to see is that people kind of move away, for example, from growing some of those specialist crops to growing cereals as the productivity of the soil changes. So, how people respond will, either through the degradation of the soil or through re-wetting, I think will vary on different people's kind of economic choices. What we don't think at the moment, and we certainly, we haven't got any evidence that would support the fact that this is going to have a significant impact on food security. No.
Okay, thank you. Alan, did I see you indicating?
Yeah, so I think there's a combination of change and choice that's here. But I was going to start with some stats, which I'm sure the committee has, but from the Office of National Statistics 2019, cost of restoring peatlands, 8.4 billion. Total economic benefits of restoring those peatlands, 109 billion. So significant benefits. If you look at the two big areas of lowland peat, one is the Somerset Levels, the other is the Fens. Very, very different in terms of what changes might look like. Arguably, a switch of livestock could be a long-term solution in the levels. So as opposed to coming out of agriculture, a switch of the type of livestock, I think the fens is altogether more complicated. As Gabrielle has said, long term, this is not a sustainable form of agriculture with the levels of peat loss that are being seen. But there might be transitional choices that need to be made around what the balance of priority looks like in that transition.
And next, probably final question from me is, are you confident that the commitment to reduce emissions from peatlands will contribute meaningfully to the total 535 billion carbon savings pledged in the 7th carbon budget? Do you feel that that's achievable and on track?
So, I mean, decisions haven't been made about, how you would share out that budget and, what the peak contribution to that would be at the moment. So, at the moment we're very focused on keeping on track for the trajectory for delivery of Carbon Budget 6 and thinking about what kind of the wider measures would be beyond that. So I don't know I can answer your specific question because I think, the broader work across government on that is not quite there yet.
Okay. Craig, are you looking at me with an intention of speaking or just looking at me?
No, just paying attention, which I think is important.
Hey, thank you very much. Jonathan Davis.
Thank you, Chairman. We've got some questions about the relationship between infrastructure and how we manage the trade-offs between the natural world peatlands more specifically. And I guess actually this is a question that governments have been thinking about for many decades in this and comparable countries. And Mr Wilson will ask some questions about this too. Building onshore wind farms on peatlands results in a compression of peat and increased greenhouse gas emissions. There is planning guidance and a carbon calculator to address this in Scotland. Why isn't there in England? And I'd like to ask that to Natural England.
I'm not sure I can answer why there isn't a carbon calculator in England. What we have is a policy presumption that steers away from onshore wind farms on peatland unless there are no alternatives. However, the challenge, as you'll be aware, is that bare areas in our uplands, which are suitable for wind generation, also tend to be suitable for peatlands and very often have the best peatlands on them. So there's a policy presumption that steers away. What we can do at the moment, or need to do at the moment, is address applications that come through on a case-by-case basis, looking at how you can first, if you're not going to avoid, how you can mitigate, and if you cannot mitigate, how you compensate, so working your way through that hierarchy. To be candid, it is very, very difficult to do anything meaningful in the way of compensation. For the reasons that we outlined at the start, we're talking about a finite resource that takes thousands of years to establish. So the only way you can compensate on one site, frankly, is by restoring another area that's already there. So you're diminishing the resource by definition. So compensation is more qualitative rather than quantitative. In terms of management on site and mitigation, that again is difficult. In some cases, applications we're seeing involve what's called micro-siting, so trying to locate the turbines in areas that are least sensitive. That remains fraught because the infrastructure needed with wind turbine sites involves tracks and cables, and where those cross important hydrology, you can end up damaging the functional site, even if the turbines aren't located on those areas.
Do you have information? Obviously, we know 1 hectare of peatland can sink 5,000 tonnes of carbon. Do you know how much peatland we've lost overall to wind turbines, and whether the balance has been tipped in favour of actually reducing our dependence on carbon as a carbon generating fuel as a consequence of that?
I don't. I can inquire about those figures, but I understand the question. It would be perverse if we found ourselves trying to save carbon through wind generation at the expense of our most important carbon assets.
Do you think we'll be able to find that out ourselves quite easily, or would you perhaps let us know?
I'm happy to take that and to provide you with what information we can.
I could just add as well that, you mentioned the calculator there is in Scotland. I mean, we are aware of that, and we're actually considering the availability of similar tools within England.
We're quite transparent then when we do have a wind farm on Peatland about how much carbon capturing peat we've lost. Is that information readily available to?
I mean, it would have. I mean, that's the sort of thing you would use a calculator for. It will always be quite site specific as well.
Have you ever suggested to government through Natural England as the independent advisor to have the carbon calculator?
I'm not aware that we've suggested that, but again, that doesn't mean we haven't, but I'm not aware that we have.
Okay, thank you. So obviously this government's got a plan to roll out perhaps 150 national significant infrastructure projects over the course of this Parliament, and it's done over 30 already. To what extent do you think the designation of nationally significant infrastructure projects bypasses protection for peatlands as a vital habitat?
Question to me.
Yes, please.
So we're a statutory advisor in relation to all NSIPs. Mm-hmm. So we're not the decision maker, however. So a lot of our most important peatlands are what's called habitats sites. So they have the highest level of environmental protection associated with them. So we engage closely with those NSIPs, working our way through the mitigations hierarchy and advising on what is possible and what the environmental implications are. But ultimately, we're not the decision maker around whether peatland or nature interests are deemed more or equivalent or less important than others.
Do you find that you're able to be totally independent as a public body? Or
yes.
Yeah. Okay. Could I just finally ask, are there any of the national infrastructure projects coming forward at the moment that affect peatlands that you're worried about?
There are a number that we are aware of and we're engaged in through the NSIP process. Yes, we have expressed concerns through the process around those.
Are you able to say which they are, or is that information available?
I'm not sure if I am, so if you'll forgive me for not giving you names at this stage, but I will check what the position is around those, because our advice ultimately is public. So if I'm able to share those names, I will do.
Thank you.
By definition, if the information is public, then you can't you? I mean, I don't expect you to do it right now. Fine for you to check, but I can't think of any reason, if it's public information, what Natural England have suggested, why you couldn't tell us.
I think that's probably correct, but you will understand that the NSIP process involves asking questions and gathering information. So the point at which we have a definitive opinion is towards the end of that process, and we are mid-process.
Sammy Wilson.
In the last session, we were told from the horticultural sector that 0.07% of peatlands were actually used for extracting peat for gardening purposes. Do we have a similar figure for the amount of peatlands that are affected by wind farms, given that many of the wind farms tend to be, on my own constituency, nearly all of them are in high areas which are rich in peat, and that's where they're best sited. So do we have a figure? I mean, we've had a lot of figures given here about peatlands today. Do we have a figure for that specific use?
Not to hand, but I think that's what we were talking about a minute ago, so we'll see what we can find.
It'd be useful to have that. And maybe just for the record, could we, because so many of the wind farms are located in peat-rich areas, can we maybe just put on the record, what is the impact on those peatlands when a wind farm is located on them?
Well, I can start if you'd like. So, from a water perspective, this is this is impacted. There's material has to be removed for siting these. That has to be stored or relocated elsewhere. There are impacts on the roads. Which anywhere that If you think of a sponge, as soon as that sponge is compressed or removed, you've lost the benefits of that sponge. And as I've said before, this is about flood management, this is about water quality, this is about water storage and nature and carbon. So there are many, many benefits from this existence of peat in those areas, which are hindered and damaged by the introduction of onshore wind farms. So it's if the steps can be taken to avoid and cite carefully, that's much better before you then get to mitigation or compensation, which is very difficult.
And the likelihood is, in order to build a wind farm, as I think came up in the first session as well, you're going to need to dry the land. And there may be some techniques that are being developed that enable you to build wind farms without doing that to the same extent. But as soon as you do that, then you start to lose some of the benefits for all the kind of the reasons that Craig says. And also, I mean, it's just worth kind of bearing in mind as well for this, and it's a broader issue with some other infrastructure issues as well, that dried out peat is a bit unstable. And there are kind of issues with that, which we would certainly expect developers to be thinking about really carefully when assessing whether a peatland is the right site, how they would manage some of those risks.
In the earlier session, we were told that one of the big problems was that there seems to be no joined-up approach when it comes to peatlands. And let's just take the example we're discussing at the moment. I mean, what discussions are there when targets are set for renewable energy by DESNZ and your own department, when many of those infrastructure projects have to be located and are located on sensitive areas? I mean, is there any joint-up approach between the two departments to look at the kind of contradictions that the policy might produce?
I mean, a lot of this it comes together in some of the carbon budget work, clearly, where you're getting a whole range of targets in terms of how we would try and kind of deliver the carbon reductions that we need. There are inevitably, as there are in a whole range of issues always across government, lots of kind of contradictory kind of pressures. And I think everyone is kind of really aware of those. And one of the things that we've tried to do is to make sure that those are at least surfaced through planning policy. So I think we referred to earlier that the kind of the planning policy, for example, around large-scale renewable energy, does talk about the fact that there is both a desire to have lots of new renewable infrastructure, and also to protect peatlands, and that this is going to require some kind of choices and trade-offs, and that's why you think your way through this mitigation hierarchy. In the end, those will be decisions that government needs to take about how they want to kind of balance those, and we will need to make sure that the consequences and the impacts are made extremely clear to ministers when they are making those choices.
Very often when these wind farms are proposed, we're told, it'll save so many tons of carbon, and usually it's calculated on the amount of energy which is generated, and if it was being generated by coal or gas or whatever, so much carbon be produced, and that wouldn't be the case with the wind farm. I mean, is there, because you've described fully the disruption, I've seen it in my own constituency where I've seen 9 feet of peat moved to put in roads, foundations, etc., destroying the landscape and releasing all of the carbon. I mean, should there be a requirement in any planning application and any infrastructure project of that nature to do a calculation about the amount of disruption that there is to the peat and the impact that that's likely to have on CO2 emissions, leave alone the other environmental impacts, such as the loss of nesting sites for birds, etc.?
We'd certainly expect those calculations to be part of the evidence that would support any decisions, because you're absolutely right that you do need to think about it. What is the value, the carbon value as well as the broader value of that peatland, and how does that kind of calculate against the benefits you would get from the wind generation? And that would be exactly the sort of information that you would expect ministers to have to take into account.
In your experience, is that information required on every application?
It's not so much what's been required on the application, but it's something that would need to be developed as part of the decision-making process. I mean, I suppose the thing to just point out is that, of course, for a long time we haven't had lots of onshore wind applications because there was a de facto ban for a number of years. So we are now starting to see these come through the system, and we've got new planning policy in place, so we're now going to have to kind of work through how you take the decisions given those very tricky trade-offs, which I think we're all recognising are there.
Given that in the future there's likely to be many more such applications, you've outlined the impact which it has on peatlands and the impact that's likely to have on the targets which you're setting. Do you believe this committee should be making recommendations in the future that should be an essential component of any infrastructure project application of this nature?
I would say that it's extremely important that when any decisions are made, there is full understanding of the breadth of impacts and the range of issues that need to be taken into account. I would hope that happens anyway, but clearly, re-emphasising that point is not an unhelpful thing.
Thank you very much, Carla Denny.
No, it's all right.
Good answered.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, John Whitney.
Question to the Environment Agency. To what extent could a land use framework contribute to the protection or the responsible use of peatlands?
I know that the land use framework is under consultation at the moment, and there are a number of different measures within that. What we are aiming to do with our work in the lowlands is to bring together a collaboration of people who know about their local sort of possible solutions and problems when it comes to complex environments where there's a lot of water management, conveyance of water, there are requirements for water for their agricultural growth, etc., and allow them to come up with their own local water management plans, working in conjunction with the local conveyors of water to find solutions. They fit into the picture of land use framework as far as the transition from current use to future use, but it's a complex picture in very complex environments, and so it's this is advice that the land use framework is going to offer, I believe.
Anyone else want to comment on land use framework?
So, I mean, as you know, a land use framework has been consulted on, and the purpose of that is to set a long-term vision and principles to guide how decisions are made on land use. We know that there are lots of demands for competing demands for land, and what we need to have are some kind of really kind of clear kind of principles, guidelines, tools to help kind of make those decisions, to make sure that we kind of think about how we best use land for both kind of houses, infrastructure, food production, nature recovery. And having a multifunctional approach to land, I think, is kind of really important. So, again, if you kind of think about this with a kind of a peat hat on, there are, sometimes it's presented, and we've just been talking about it in terms of wind turbines,
not
as a choice. But, for things like, I don't know, solar, there is the potential, and we're looking at elsewhere for putting kind of solar panels on land which has been re-wetted. So
heavy foundations that squash it all down.
Yeah, so thinking about the sort of potential for multifunctional use of land is really important, and kind of identifying where there are areas which, where that would create more risks. So think about it as kind of tools and principles and, all of those sort of things.
And given the sort of limitations placed on the amount of agri-investment funding that farmers can receive, how are we going to incentivise carbon or wetland farming and nature-friendly farming?
So you're talking about the cap in SFI that farmers might receive. I think there are enormous opportunities around the landscape recovery scheme in particular to work with farmers and farm groups in particular to explore ways in which they can incorporate peatland management and alongside the way that they design their businesses, and look at how they can bring private sector funding in to complement what they're doing on their farm management. So we see landscape recovery as a tool that we've longed for in conservation terms for decades, in that it provides both long-term stability of investment, and it provides a means by which you can effect transition over a period of time, rather than simply set prescriptions at the start that you have to follow through for every year for 5 years or 10 years. It really enables that change to be taken place. Your earlier question around confidence in delivering the 2050 target, landscape recovery as a key component of ELMS is critical here, because it provides that longer term certainty of funding. At the moment we've got grant schemes which have done a great job, but they're relatively short term in their outlook, and to get people to buy in at scale in ways that are complementary requires that longer term funding piece.
To Mr. Rockliff again. Horticulture was mentioned earlier on. The exploration fund, is that what effect is that having so far?
Well, in actual fact, that's been administered by Natural England, because the wetter farming, as you've described there, that offers an opportunity for farmers to diversify, to look at options, to think about the new information. But if I want to pass over to Natural England.
It is at the moment small and niche, so it would provide the opportunity to maintain a land management business, and at the very least, by raising water tables, move lands that are currently releasing carbon into a more stable regime whereby carbon isn't being lost. Whether it could then take the next step into actually accumulating carbon on top of that's yet to be clarified, but it's still small scale, it's more experimental.
Thank you. I mean, Ms. Edwards, can I just ask you said earlier, as we've heard from previous governments, that this government's position on the ban on horticultural peat is simply a matter of parliamentary time allowing. And I just want to be absolutely clear, because you've said that this is a complicated area, and we've heard some of those complications previously. But there is nothing in terms of the government's mind. It is made up on broadly what needs to happen, accepting legislation always is a sort of somewhat organic process and evolves from the second reading to the end of it. But broadly, the government has decided it wants to do this. This is a good thing. It just has decided right now it isn't a bigger priority than the other things it is talking about. So it is simply that matter is all that is to be basically concluded by the government.
Yeah, I mean that was a clear commitment in the EIP.
And so obviously we have the Secretary of State in front of us next week. We will take that up with her. I'm conscious that the previous government, I think, broadly said the same thing. New governments do have a crowded list of things that they want to do, but the previous government, we all know as MPs that were in it, there were many times we were going home early because there didn't seem to be that much of an agenda towards the end of the 14 years, but still they never got this done. So I mean, can you just give us an idea as to what the sort of reasons are why we never actually managed to make this a priority, having had these conversations with probably a number of Secretary of States over the years?
You might be a little bit above my pay grade there in terms of the kind of how the government decides on the makeup of its legislative programme. I mean, clearly there are a whole range of priorities across government, and this.
But accepting there's other priorities, I mean, can you just give us a sense as to what the sensitivities are around this? What are the things that maybe might be, say, making government think, well, let's not prioritise it? We heard previously, everyone seems to agree it's a good idea. Now, this government does quite a lot of things that not everyone agrees is a good idea, and every government does. So why not get on with doing something that everyone thinks is a good idea?
We've got to have a suitable legislative vehicle, and there are lots of other pressures on the legislative programme. I mean, I think if you were to go... I haven't been working on this policy for the last kind of 10 years, but if you were to go back 10 years, I suspect you wouldn't have seen quite so much of a consensus amongst your first group of witnesses about the kind of feasibility, cost, etc. of a transition. Clearly, the market has shifted, evidence has shifted, and there is now a much broader kind of consensus that this is the way to go. And so, you would hope that this would then be less controversial than it might have been if this had been up 10 years ago. But in terms of the government's broader kind of prioritisation, there's a lot of things that they want to legislate on.
Could I just ask one question? I mean, the reason given was it was complicated. And I mean, first of all, we've got the people who are affected by it saying that they're willing to embrace it. Secondly, they say that there are alternatives. Alternatives actually that would give them materials from our own country. Thirdly, customers are happy and indeed demanding it. Where are the complications?
I don't disagree with any of that, and that's absolutely clear. I think just any piece of legislation where there are kind of market issues and transitional issues, etc., it's complicated. That doesn't mean that we can't do it. That's not a reason why we haven't done it. I've just said that it's not this is not going to be a 3-clause bill. So it is going to be a slightly tricky piece of legislation, but we are working on it. We will continue working on it, and at some point there will be, it will reach the top of the list in terms of the government's priorities for legislation.
It sounds like this government could have a policy that even the DUP would support. So that, if that's not reason enough for them to get on with it, I don't know what is. So anyway, we'll take that up with the Minister next week.
From an official perspective, we certainly want to make sure that we are ready to go. We've done the work with the devolved governments. That's what we've committed to do, so that there is a piece of legislation that can be taken forward at the time that there is parliamentary time to do so.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you to all three of you for that evidence, and we will now bring this one-off session to a close. This sitting is suspended.